All right, so we're now into panel 2, and let's see what we can do here. So I want to say a couple of things. It says how the nation was won, moderator Dennis Speed. Well, how would the nation be won? Let's quote something from a great American patriot. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free. What great American patriot made that statement? That statement was made by Ho Chi Minh and is the beginning of the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Party, Republic of Vietnam, September 2nd, 1945. Do you all remember this part of the Declaration of Independence, which was, by the way, written by Thomas Jefferson, though someone earlier tried to tell me differently? The king has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to make a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people upon whom he has also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. No, you don't remember that because that was excised from the final document. Had it appeared in the document, however, it would have been the longest of the grievances that was actually transmitted in the original draft. So let's take another example. Many people have, and I think you've all had this experience recently, talk about how could it be the case that we would wish to honor the slaveholders and the criminals, the genocidalists that created the United States. I don't think most of the people that make those statements ever had to found nations in the way that Ho Chi Minh did, or had to found whole movements. And here's a quote from, some of you are aware of this quote, I think, made April 18th, 1955. The battle against colonialism is a long one. And do you know that today is a famous anniversary in that battle? On the 18th day of April, 1775, just 185 years ago, Paul Revere rode at midnight through the New England countryside, warning of the approach of British troops and of the opening of the American War of Independence, the first successful anti-colonial war in history. That statement was made at the Bandung Conference in the opening by President Sukarno, which was the first gathering, as people know, of Afro-Asian countries, actually in history, who were seeking their independence. So there are people who understand that to win a nation, whether they be in Vietnam or Indonesia. And I will just reference that Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana famously attempted to organize what he called the United States of Africa, directly modeled on the United States of America. In fact, he worked not too far from here, right down in Chester, Pennsylvania, at the old Sunoco Sun Oil shipyards, the Sun shipyards. Went to Lincoln University also, Pennsylvania. So the issue of winning our nation is, first of all, to recognize that the American experiment was not only unique, it was one that those who knew that they would have to found nations knew that they would need to replicate. I don't have a copy of our good friend, the late Graham Lowry's How the Nation Was Won here with me right now, but that title comes from his book and from something that he did for several of us back in 1987 in particular. And one of the people for whom he did that is about to speak. He spoke to you earlier. Graham Lowry took myself and Bob Wesser, Chris Sare, you may have been there, I think also Diane, a lot of us. He took us on this tour around Boston. And his wife, Pam, had written a lot of the actual placards that were on exhibit along the Boston Freedom or Liberty Trail, as they called it. And when Graham spoke about these things, it was like you could see the people. You could see the situation. It was a situation in which it was as though you were being taken through the history, not just by someone who had been there, but someone who had written it. And I don't mean written a book about it. That's what we do. That's what this conference is about. That's what this campaign is about. And so I'd like to introduce for the second section of his presentation, Christopher Sare. And it says, what is the American system? Sorry. First slide.
Well, happy 250th birthday, my friends. Right down the street here, from here, 250 years ago, a seeming miracle occurred. It was actually a tremendous amount of hard work. We're trying to pull off a similar miracle right now. It's always a fight. It doesn't just happen. And if history is presented in any other way, it's a fraud. So this is the Declaration of Independence, but we're going to go back a little bit. The potential for a Republican foothold in the Americas was under assault by the British Venetian oligarchy from its inception. So in 1629, John Winthrop, who we ended with in the last presentation, he wrote Reasons to be Considered for Justifying the Plantation in New England, where he laid out the moral necessity for creating a republic in the New World. He says basically that the land of England has grown weary of its inhabitants. So a man who is the most precious of all creatures is here more vile and base than the earth we tread upon and of less price among us. He says, it has come to pass that children, servants, and neighbors, especially if they be poor, are counted the greatest burden, which if things were right, would be the chiefest earthly blessing. The whole earth is the Lord's garden, and he hath given it to the sons of men with a general condition, Genesis 1:28, increase and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it. That's John Winthrop. The British had a different idea. And in the same year, they created a sugar plantation in Barbados. And you can see here slaves working hard for their British masters. And this was, in a sense, the answer of Charles I to the fact that, Winthrop had organized Charles I to give the Massachusetts Bay Charter, to create the Massachusetts Bay Charter. But at the same time, they were creating this. And by 1636, 7 years later, a law would be passed condemning hundreds of thousands of souls to racial, lifelong, and hereditary slavery. A different kind of slavery, a slavery that you couldn't work your way out of, that your children couldn't work their way out of. No, it was lifelong, hereditary, and that was it. And so that's the kind of slavery that the British Empire was pushing in the world. The oligarchical hell of the 30 Years' War, which was just another flare-up of meat grinder religious wars and oligarchical wars that had ravaged Europe for decades, like the 100 Years' War we talked about earlier, was destroying Europe. And in a bold move, Winthrop managed to get a charter signed by Charles I. Winthrop was elected governor for 1 year by the General Court. He created the General Court. And on June 12th, 1630, 800 passengers landed in Salem Harbor. Winthrop gave his sermon a model of Christian charity, stating, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." So that was the weight on his shoulders. I'm not saying he was perfect. I'm not saying the Puritans were perfect. I'm not going to claim that at all. But they were doing this, and this was exciting, and this was interesting, and it was different. And they had the weight of all humanity on their shoulders. 2,000 more colonists would arrive by February 1631. And the first Thanksgiving Day was declared as desperately needed new supplies arrived. Realizing the terrible mistake that had occurred, the King's Privy Council ordered this charter to be returned to England in 1634, to which Winthrop politely replied that that could only be done by the General Court, which wouldn't be convening until September. When it did convene, instead of handing back the charter, it allocated funds for a military defense of the colony. Fortifications were built up at Castle Island in Boston Harbor, Charlestown, and Dorchester. That was going to happen again. Dorchester. The king backed down, but again demanded the charter be returned in 1638. Winthrop replied, "Lastly, if our patents be taken from us, the common people here will conceive that His Majesty has cut them off, and that hereby they are freed from their allegiance and subjugation, and thereupon will be ready to confederate themselves under a new government for their necessary safety and subsistence." He began efforts to establish the United Colonies of New England. In 1643, he was elected president of the New England Confederation, and they wrote up Articles of Confederation that would later be cited by Benjamin Franklin during the American Revolution. The 1640s brought compulsory education to all children, a body of liberties a written criminal code. Unlike in England, laws were to be known and printed and distributed. With the chaos of the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I, he lost his head, John Winthrop Jr. his son, was sent to England to recruit skilled labor for iron manufacturing. Upon his return, the General Court granted what would become the Saugus Iron Works a 21-year monopoly, necessary lands and a 10-year tax exemption. It was the first automated, integrated industrial complex in the New World. Output of 8 tons per week after the first year put it ahead of the best works in England. The colony's economic sovereignty went further with the creation of a mint in 1652. And here you see the pine tree shillings, the famous pine tree shilling, redeemable only in the country, used as credit for the physical development of the colony, shipbuilding, etc. Until then, only kings could mint money. The currency's main value was not the silver itself, but the sovereign intention of the government to deploy that currency as credit to finance the physical economic development of infrastructure, agriculture, shipbuilding, and other industries. Lyndon LaRouche used to famously say, money is an idiot. And he is right. He was right. Money is an idiot. Money must only be the creation of a sovereign government for doing something good for the general welfare of the people. By 1650, the population had grown to 20,000 inhabitants. Winthrop then moved to secure the Connecticut flank, bringing in Saybrook, New London, establishing ironworks in New Haven. Here's a grist mill that he built in New London, Connecticut. With the Stuart Restoration, with the end of the Revolution in England, John Winthrop went to Charles II and actually managed to obtain a new charter on April 23rd, 1662. Charles was still fairly weak, even though he was back in power. They were still fairly weak, but soon there would be a full-blown assault on the colonies. The Stuarts were intent on crushing the potential of this developing colony, preferring to impose an economy in the New World based on raw material exports and slavery, in complete opposition to the sovereignly productive economy that Winthrop was organizing. And these pigs, the Restoration kings, Charles II and his brother, Duke of York, later James II, they founded the Royal Africa Company, which went on to carry more African slaves to the Americas than any other company in the history of the African slave trade. Who was their philosopher? The guy that we're told inspired the American Revolution, John Locke, who was picked up by an ambitious Anthony Ashley Cooper, otherwise known as Lord Shaftesbury. Lord Shaftesbury and John Locke teamed up to write the brutal Constitution of the Carolinas, which created a slave system in the Carolinas, setting forth a system of perpetuated slavery. Many of the slaves brought in from Barbados and other places. So this was now an infection that was being brought into the United States in direct counter to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and that conception of Republican government that was being attempted up there. They were both of these creeps, Shaftesbury and John Locke. For people who hear John Locke was an enlightened guy, no, they were shareholders in the Royal African Company, founding shareholders. It's a dirty lie. This is the philosopher that lying British historians say inspired life, liberty, and property. But the problem with that lie, of course, anybody who reads it, is it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's not property. So where did pursuit of happiness come from? Well, we know from Dave Shaven and what he was saying earlier, it's Leibniz. Now, meanwhile, back in Europe, there's a battle that had continued. Cardinal Mazarin organized the end of this oligarchical 30 Years' War with the remarkable Treaty of Westphalia, which is now viciously attacked by creatures such as Tony Blair. Based on the sovereign nation states committing to the benefit of the other. It forgave, quote, the sins of the past by leaving all wrongs that have been committed to perpetual oblivion. It turned France into a mediator for peace. It only succeeded because of an economic policy called dirigism, as Mazarin saw the development of the European river systems as a great economic corridors for the benefit of all, not as a means to grab more territory for France. The myth was, well, the Rhine would be a great border and France should have everything up to the Rhine, which they do now. But back then, he saw it as German territory, and the idea was it was going to be developed for the benefit of the Germans as part of ending this 30 Years' War from to free them from the Habsburgs. And so this is the Mazarin and Colbert later unleashing 3 centuries of canal building in Europe. And you can see the Rhine all linked up to the Danube, linked up in the north, all of these canals brought great development to Europe and to the average person in Europe, benefited greatly from this. You'll also see this canal down in France, the Languedoc Canal, which I'll get to. So, it turned France, so the problem with these rivers until then was that you had these toll collectors, all these petty nobility, and they were toll collectors. And so it was choking the economy of Europe. And they had no commitment to any people except themselves. In 1661, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the protege of Cardinal Mazarin, became the Comptroller General of the finances in France under Louis XIV. Essentially picking up where Louis XI left off, Colbert battled the feudal nobility of tax farmers, a different kind of farmer, that recognized no nation of France above their power and impoverished the peasant population. He imprisoned the former superintendent of finance, Nicolas Fouquet, the chief of all tax farmers, who had served as a blackmail operative of private bankers against King Louis XIV himself. Not only the government could, only the government could collect regulated taxes. Many nobles were sent back to work. Industries were promoted with the direct credit and protective tariffs deployed against the dumping of cheap goods in France by the Dutch, the Venetians, and others. Between 1666 and 1669, Colbert created the French Academy of Sciences, with Christian Huygens being brought in from the Netherlands as its first president. Gottfried Leibniz and Denis Papin, the creator of the first steam engine, studied under Huygens. The Languedoc Canal was begun under chief engineer Pierre-Paul Riquet, fulfilling Leonardo da Vinci's dream. Leonardo's last year of his life, he was talking about building this canal, a Renaissance man. Developing the interior of France, the interior of France, a development corridor, and breaking the control of the Anglo-Dutch-Venetian maritime trade routes around the Strait of Gibraltar. Fortifications were built by the great engineer Sébastien Vauban. The Paris Observatory was created, the Academy of Opera founded, and the Academy of Architecture founded in those 3 years under Colbert. In 1671, Gottfried Leibniz wrote Society and Economy, arguing for manufactured goods to be produced locally, breaking the monopoly of merchants and lifting the conditions of artisans, the people that make the things. He advocated for government-sponsored national industry and technological progress, such as heat-powered machines, to increase human productivity, eliminate monopolies, and balance wealth between merchants and artisans. And why indeed should so many people be poor and miserable for the benefit of such a small handful? After all, is it not the entire purpose of society to release the artisan from his misery? That's what Leibniz asks. In 1674, Charles II formally revokes the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter back in the Americas. James II becomes the king the next year, and in 3 years, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 makes William of Orange and James II's daughter, Mary, William and Mary, the regents of the Anglo-Dutch Empire. Taking advantage of the chaos in England, Waite Winthrop leads a revolt in Boston and arrests the British governors Andros and William Dudley. In 1961, Massachusetts Bay Colony leader Cotton Mather issues a polemical paper called Some Consideration on Bills of Credit, where he challenged the people of New England to accept paper money by the government over silver and gold, based solely on the sovereignty of the nation. This was especially bold since it wasn't even a nation yet. And he goes on and asks this question to them: you accept all kinds of bills of goods from companies. How come you don't accept a currency from our government, which is founded for your general welfare? In 1692, Andros is sent back to govern the slave state of Virginia. These Brits don't give up. In 1710, Cotton Mather made clear his vision of a nation's mission in his Essays to Do Good, which Diane Sare wrote a tremendous article on in the latest Leonora. And he talks about what an invaluable honor to do good it is. We should vigorously pursue those noble and blessed ends for which it is ordained, the good of mankind. It's Cotton Mather. Ben Franklin, born in 1706, 4 years before this great work was written. He read it when he was 11 years old. It had a formative effect. Franklin spent the rest of his life, doing good. He created the first public fire department and the first public hospital in Philadelphia. Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood made Franklin the postmaster for Philadelphia in 1737. Throughout his life, Franklin was committed to creating a nationwide postal service. He founded the American Philosophical Society here in Philadelphia in 1744 with a call to spread scientific knowledge to improve the conditions of mankind. Franklin was committed to the general welfare long before the Constitution had concretized the idea. Shortly after the founding of the APS, the young George Washington was surveying the mountains of Virginia, carrying out Spotswood's dream of expanding the colonies to the west beyond the Appalachians, which the British were hell-bent on stopping. As was mentioned earlier, the Ohio Company smashed. At the same time, they passed the Iron Act of 1750, which forbade the colonies from producing iron. George Washington's father was an iron producer in Virginia and Maryland. They demanded instead that it be imported from England. The Currency Act of 1751 forbade the colonies from issuing bills of credit. So you see what the Brits are afraid of: production, manufacturing, and credit. They want to smash it. On top of that, in the 1763 Treaty of Paris, after the French and Indian War, so-called, the empire is at the top of its game, and they basically say, we're going to create this line here, and you can't develop, the colonies can't go to the west of that. George Washington, a farmer on the Potomac whose father had produced iron in Acca Creek tributary, saw raw materials and grains going down the river and finished goods from England coming back up, the quality of which was going down as the price went up. On April 5th, 1769, Washington wrote to George Mason of Virginia supporting a boycott of British goods. At a time when our lordly masters in Great Britain will be satisfied with nothing less than the deprivation of American freedom, it seems highly necessary that something should be done. Maintain the liberty with which we have derived from our ancestors. The revolution became a necessity, and of course, General Washington became our commander-in-chief. 250 years ago, the Declaration of Independence was read by General Washington to the troops in New York City in the beginning of the revolution. But even the miraculous victory of that revolution was just the beginning of an even more important fight. As Hamilton stated in the first Federalist paper, arguing for the ratification of the Constitution, he says, it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend on their political constitutions through accident and force. Military victory at Yorktown created the potential for a republic, but it was not a foregone conclusion at all. Washington and his friends were ever concerned that the states now bound by the Articles of Confederation would soon split apart. Oligarchical Europe would be proven correct, that ours would be a failed experiment. The victory against the empire was always precarious. Just during the revolution, various states held back troops and money throughout the war. I want to tell here a story about Elkanah Watson. He's 19 years old. He served in the American Revolution. He's not well known, but I love him. His first mission was to carry money and papers down to General George Walton, one of the signers of the Declaration, who was in Georgia. Watson, who was from Plymouth, Massachusetts, was horrified to see the widespread slavery for the first time in his life. Upon entering Virginia, he noted the general poverty of the South and was shocked beyond the power of language to see slaves for the first time, noting that my New England feelings were constantly aroused and agitated by the aspect of slavery in this land of freedom. But he noted Northern men, in yielding to their instincts which revolt at slavery and indulging in the strictures upon its existence and atrocities, should consider the fact that he that impulses of northern cupidity aided its introduction by the agency of northern ships and capital. How many of the princely fortunes of New England had their basis in the slave trade? Elkanah took note of the Potomac and James River, the Dismal Swamp, and other bodies of water, and he took constant note of the internal improvements that could be made to bring wealth and industry to the South. Along the road which stretched from the Susquehanna to the Schuylkill, he noted, the verdure of the fields, this is on his way back, the verdure of the fields, the neatness of the superior tillage of the farms was so grateful to the eye after being accustomed to southern scenes as to make us almost insensible to the bad roads. The contrast so obvious and so strong in the appearance of these farms and the southern plantations will strike every observer and can only be imputed to but one cause. Here we witness the impulses and results of honest industry where free men labor for themselves. On the way back north, he saw Washington and the troops suffering at Valley Forge. After 10 months, Elkanah reached Providence of Rhode Island. As Washington and Lafayette would later do, he had made a tour of the entire nation, 2,700 miles. At this point in his memoirs, he reflects upon the whole of his trip and produces one of the most exciting polemics on the potential of this nation. He talks about the potential of the nation, blessed with every climate, every capable of every production, abounding with the best harbors, etc. He says, the sagacious statesmen of Europe realize these truths and already dread the influence which the greatness and prosperity of America is destined to exercise upon the whole world. The European politicians may consider these events too remote to affect any portion of the present generation of men. Still, they will obstruct our progress by every means in their power. Their efforts will be as vain as they are presumptuous. Next, he went on to work with Benjamin Franklin in France, and he toured all the canals of France, the Netherlands, and England. He's on an intelligence mission looking at these canals because he knows he's got to come back to the United States and bring this intelligence. He meets with General George Washington in Mount Vernon in 1785. They speak about canals for 2 days straight. Washington was the president of the Potomac Canal Company, where he was riveted with the necessity to connect the states with infrastructure that would bind them together and cement the potential for our growing agro-industrial economy and make sure that we wouldn't split up. The plague of states' rights immediately became apparent when a fight broke out between Maryland and Virginia over the ownership and the toll rights of the Potomac Canal. Washington invites people to Mount Vernon to discuss it. No good. This leads to the Annapolis Convention of 1786. 7 states are needed for a quorum, only 5 show up. But Hamilton is there, and he proposes that there be a convention in May of the following year, 1787. And that's what occurs. And Washington, Hamilton, Franklin, Madison, Gouverneur Morris, who are all important, who wrote the all-important preamble, Gouverneur Morris, Jose's friend, took bold action to completely scrap the Articles of Convention and write a bold constitution, creating a United States of we the people, not we of the 13 states. And here's the quartet that made it possible. Hamilton, Madison, John Jay, who wrote the Federalist Papers, and without George Washington, it would have never happened. But it was ratified, and they're referred to as the quartet. Washington and Hamilton got to work quickly around the creation of a national bank, which is standing down the street here. Diane did a video there yesterday, you can watch. It was obvious that the debts of the various states, some larger than others, some states paid more because some states gave more to the revolution, so they were more in debt. This had to be combined into one. It was also obvious to them that the national bank was necessary to create public credit for the new nation, for internal improvements so manufacture and agriculture could flourish. Hamilton spoke of the great Colbert and what he had done in France 100 years earlier. But a bitter fight broke out immediately with the slaveocracy, who argued that the government, if the government had the power to do these things, create a bank, internal improvements, they'd have the power to abolish slavery. Well, indeed it would. We had been infected with this hideous oligarchical disease. It would take a bloody civil war to free ourselves from this, and one could easily argue we're still not free from this backwardness. Madison, who had argued for the Constitution and a strong central government during the Constitutional Convention, had gotten taken over by the Jeffersonian states' rights gang and actually took down our national bank in 1811 when he was president. After the near disaster of just barely pulling off a victory in the War of 1812, Madison was forced to restore the bank, creating the Second National Bank in his last year as president, which lasted until Andrew Jackson and Van Buren destroyed it. But nonetheless, Madison would still vote down the bonus bill as his last act. The bonus bill would have authorized the use of U.S. budget surplus to be directly invested into internal improvements in the nation. Somehow he found this unconstitutional. Well, it's not a surprise, because 50 years later, the Confederate Constitution would specifically outlaw its Congress from investing in internal improvements. By name, outlaw, no internal improvements under the Confederate Constitution. A happier example is James Monroe, who was our next president. Monroe had been an anti-federalist in Virginia during the fight for ratification, but he had come around completely to the view, with the help of his fellow Virginian Chief Justice John Marshall, that a strong federal government was necessary for the development and protection of our nation and people, and a national bank was absolutely constitutional. For the next 12 years, from 1817 to 1829, a tremendous growth of economic power was unleashed in the United States under Monroe and his vice president, later President John Quincy Adams. And the animosities of the party system were squelched, at least for a little while. Patriots in New York, tired of waiting for the Jefferson and Madison presidencies to act, had organized state funding for the construction of the Erie Canal beginning in 1817. Its completion in 1825 served as proof of principle of what could be accomplished in America if we set our minds to it. It also served as an American school of engineering, taught many, many engineers. Under Sylvanus Thayer, Monroe's superintendent of West Point, and Joseph Gardner Swift, the Army Corps of Engineers was deployed to plan and build ports, dams, canals, and railroads all across the United States. Thayer had been sent to France in 1815 to study the engineering and mathematical knowledge of the École Polytechnique, the legacy of Colbert's circles, founded by Gaspard Monge. Monroe signed the General Survey Act on April 30th, 1824, authorizing the president to employ military and civil engineers to survey, plan, and estimate routes for roads and canals of national importance. The War Department executed the statute through the Board of Engineers for Internal Improvements, formed May 31st, 1824. John Quincy Adams, a great and highly underrated president, made use of this to the fullest until his untimely defeat 4 years later by Andrew Jackson. You can see the canals that were built under him, set into motion and built. Even the stupidity of Jackson and Van Buren were unable to fully stop the momentum of the Monroe-Adams program, as can be seen by the progress accomplished by 1840. But it would take the great President Abraham Lincoln to save the Republic and set things back on track.
Our next speaker is Robert Wesser, speaking on a new fabric destined to cover the surface of the globe.
Okay, so speaking of John Quincy Adams, on the 45th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, he gave a very famous speech in front of the Congress. He was invited to speak as Secretary of State. They read the Declaration then. Every July 4th, the whole Congress read the document. How do you like that? Maybe we should go back to that. Yeah, so he says the following. He says, in a conflict of 7 years, the history of the war by which you guys sitting there in the Congress, maintained that declaration became the history of the civilized world. It was the first declaration Nation of the only legitimate fabric foundation of civil government. It was the cornerstone of a new fabric destined to cover the surface of the globe. It demolished at a stroke the lawfulness of all governments founded upon conquest. It swept away all the rubbish and accumulated servitude of centuries of servitude. A nation was born in a day. It stands and must forever stand alone, a beacon on the summit of the mountain to which all the inhabitants of the earth may turn their eyes for a genial and saving light, a light of salvation and redemption to the oppressed. And in this is much longer speech, what Helga referred to as this famous, we're not going abroad, monsters seeking monsters to destroy, is also in this speech. My clicker going here. This is reiterated by Washington in the famous farewell address, where he says, in terms of foreign relations of our nation, it's only extending commerce. Sorry. Hold on 1 second. Sorry about this. Okay. And otherwise, harmony, liberal intercourse with all nations. This is recommended by policy of humanity and interest, consulting the natural course of things, diffusing and diversifying by gentle means the streams of commerce, but forcing nothing. So that's our relation to the world. We're going to share what we've developed here. Now, this is a story that almost no Americans know of, and our late deceased friend, Mark Calney, did a lot of research on it. It's called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. It was established in 1810 by Quincy Adams and two of the top intelligence operatives of Washington during the war. John Jay, who was assigned to basically uncover all the British and Loyalist conspiracies against the revolution, and Elias Boudinot, who actually did the same. His father was a collaborator, very close collaborator of Benjamin Franklin, and a guy by the name of Jedediah Morse, who is Samuel F.B. Morse's father, right? And this is ostensibly foreign missions, right? So the Christians are going to go out and they're going to, proselytize the heathens. But that's not what it is. It's a way where we can now go all over the planet and scope out, okay, how do we spread this new fabric? Where can we go, right? We've beat the British here, we can beat them anywhere. And it's amazing. They go to, Thailand. This is a very famous story. Anton Chaitkin wrote a whole play about it. Dan Beach Bradley tries to basically, assist the king in fighting off the British and the Opium War into Thailand. Hawaii, the Sandwich Islands. This becomes the center of American intelligence operations into Asia and into the Pacific. And what they do there is absolutely amazing. This ultimately ends up being the recruitment ground of the great Chinese patriots Sun Yat-sen. China. They go into China. Now remember, China is being split apart. It's being ripped apart by the Opium Wars. And then you have the Taiping Rebellion. Well, we go in there and we recruit some of the top Confucian Mandarin. China's occupied by the Manchus. Confucian patriots, and we say, hey, here's what we just did. We just beat the British. Here's how Washington did it. And they're like, whoa, that's awesome. And I've written papers on this, which I can get to people if you're interested in. It's an absolutely fascinating story. And what's their weapons? What do we bring abroad? Well, we're not going over there with fighter jets and bombs. We're going with printing presses, agricultural implements, tools, all in that quote that David read about the Cook expedition. We're going to lift people up to a better way of life. And that's the mission. That just shows the number of pages they printed, which is a lot. So, meanwhile, back home, as Chris was saying, we're building up the nation and building up the interior. But I want to show this specific, this graphic, because if you look at This is only 10 years. The left, very left map is 1850. The center map is 1860. So you can see the explosion under the Hamilton system of these railroads, but in the north. But look at the map in the middle in the south. They're not interested in railroads, maybe just to get some of the cotton to the ports to go off to England, right? And you can step on the right, tells the whole story, because that's where the majority of slavery is in the United States. And what is this? And this is the problem, right? We're not going to go any further until we solve this problem, because the reality is the Confederate States are part of the British Empire. So 90% of the cotton goes from the South to England. They use slave laborers and all those horrible images you've seen of little kids in, textile factories. They take the textiles, they sell them to India for what? Opium. And then they push the opium into China. So this is one big global slave dope empire, which a whole section of our country is a part of. And of course, we have to solve that. I'm going to skip this, which we do from 1861 to 1865 in the defeat of the Confederacy and the reassertion of the Declaration of Independence, which those of you would maybe will hear more of that from Richard, know that this was Lincoln's passion from the time he gave his first speech at the Young Men's Lyceum in the 1830s, saying, if we don't revive this declaration, our nation is finished. And we do, with the help of the Russians, by the way. So the irony is, we go through this horrific civil war, which was horrific, and we come out of it as the most productive nation in the history of mankind. And I won't go through the numbers, but you see thousands and thousands of people deployed in factories, machine shops, foundries, 2 million tons of steel. This graphic is actually of Paterson, New Jersey, which was Hamilton's vision of the first industrial city. But it could have been Philadelphia. Everything's produced. Locomotives, steel, machine tools, the whole works. 1869, Transcontinental Railroad is completed. I always show this picture because in it you see the Chinese laborers, skilled laborers. They were not slaves, they were not coolies. They did a lot better in many, many things than the so-called white Americans did. But they were treated like garbage, and they were very proud to do it, by the way. There's a whole book on that if you want to read about it. Lincoln's ambassador to China, Anson Burlingame, says, okay, no more exploitation of this nation of China. This is a dignified ancient culture. We're going to take the leadership of this country and we're going to take it all over the globe, and they're going to recognize this place as a sovereign nation on equal footing of every other. Total revolution. And we signed a treaty, the Burlingame Treaty. And the treaty is a win-win treaty. We equal trade, you can come over here and be citizens, etc., right? There's even a whole plan to build the railroads and whatnot in China, which doesn't, unfortunately, come to fruition. Japan, right? Henry Carey, who is the inheritor of Alexander Hamilton's economics and perfects it, he's the one that really put Lincoln in the White House. His ally, E. Peshine Smith, an American economist, goes to Japan, works with the Japanese government. They create a first national bank, which is basically Hamilton's conception of a national bank, and they completely develop Japan. The Japanese send an international mission. I think it's like 2 years or something like that. They spend like 2 months in the United States. And you can see, I love the picture, right? Because in the middle is Prince Iwakura, who has his traditional garb on. But then you look at all these other gentlemen, you can't even tell that they're actually Japanese because they're very proud to wear their Western, garbs, right? Not because of anything, but we are developing into a modern nation. And this gets us into a lot of trouble because with the bad guys. Because what happens is, in 1869, we send Governor Curtin, who was the governor here of Pennsylvania during the Civil War, and Grant appoints him as ambassador to to Russia. And as the going off ceremonies. He's going up, speaking to the Russian ambassador. He's saying, join us, Russians, in girdling the globe with the tramway of iron. And he says explicitly, we're going to work with you guys to build a railroad from the Baltic to the Sea of Okhotsk, to the Pacific Ocean. Trans-Siberian Railroad, right? And you go to look at the bottom there, he says, we're going to outflank the movement made by France and England for predominance in the East through the Suez Canal, and America and Russia can dictate peace to the world from St. Petersburg and Washington, D.C. Uh-oh, no more empire. Okay, so here we are. Whoa, 1876. It's a centennial. Okay, so how are we going to celebrate? Well, they bring in all the soccer leagues from around the world, and then they have the Germans make all these hot dogs. They don't do any of that. This is William Kelly, big ally of Lincoln, was a congressman from here in Pennsylvania, and he's the one that puts the proposition before the Congress. How are we going to celebrate? I'm going to read this whole thing because it's quite something. He says, the proposed exhibition is to celebrate events that are not merely of national, but of worldwide interest. It is to commemorate not a day, but an epic in universal history, not an event, but a series of events that occurred in rapid succession that gave birth to Republican liberty and organized a nation that stands today among the nations of the world. This bill proposes to invite the people of London, Paris, etc., the world at large, to behold the results of 1 century of Republican liberty in a country whose people are the offspring of those of every land and clime, and to challenge them to present the best results of their genius, experience, and labor in comparison with those of this young nation, of heterogeneous and free people. So this is great, right? Here's what we did under these conceptions of freedom in the Declaration, the Constitution, et cetera. And that's what it is. Grant says something similar. He says we want to give our emphatic expression to our earnest desire to cultivate the friendship of our fellow members of this great family of nations. This image is the main exhibition hall. You can't see it, but under those 3 arches, that's a 10,000 person chorus. And they sang Handel's Hallelujah chorus from the Messiah, among other things. So this is a Grant Bowl. That's nothing. So what's the name of the exhibition? It's the International Exhibition, this is the centennial, of arts, manufacturers, and products of the salt and mine in the city of Philadelphia. So they literally build, this is Fairmount Park, right here in Philadelphia. They build essentially a whole city, some of the specs. You know, they have 16 bridges and 250 buildings erected and, waterworks, right? Plumbing, the whole thing. So there's nothing like this in the world at all. This is kind of a bird's eye view, right? So you see the main exhibition hall, there's a machinery hall, there's an art gallery, women's pavilion, agricultural hall, horticultural hall, etc. So this is incredible. This is machinery hall. So you look at the little people, look at the hall. And I don't think, maybe the Versailles is that big, I'm not sure. But it seems to me like it'd be one of the largest buildings ever built. What's in Machinery Hall? Wow, machines, a lot of them, from all over the world, right? You see Krupp guns there from Germany, Britain. You're walking through this and you're seeing the most advanced technology in the planet from everywhere. The largest steam engine ever built, coreless duplex machine. This is in the middle of the machinery hall, running everything with 2 miles of belts. 14,000 horsepower. That's about the power of a small modular nuclear reactor. Steam engine. It's huge, absolutely huge. There it is in the middle of the exhibition with railroad, with probably Baldwin locomotives. These are the locomotives we shipped to South America, to Russia, etc. There's a bevel cutting machine. You have the first kind of internal combustion engine. The Germans brought over a first kind of initial refrigeration machine, pretty big. Couldn't put that in your kitchen. Typewriter. And of course, Bell's telephonic telegraphic receiver. Well, that might have really thrown people for a loop, right? 37 nations, and we invite all the colonies. So India's there, that's a British colony. We're treating these as nations, even though they're colonies of empires. Germany plays a huge role in this. Henry Carey, Lincoln's economist, works are translated into German. That's what's used by the people around Bismarck to develop modern Germany and actually unify Germany for the first time. Russians, big exhibition, science, geography, chemistry, and at the exhibition is Dmitry Mendeleev, the discoverer of the periodic tables, but also, as importantly, the father of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, who works with Americans later on to do that. So he's there in 1876. Japan, we have China, India. So 10 million, just under 10 million visitors and participants. Now, this is like over 6 months. So it's from May to November 1876. This is a famous statue, I don't know whatever happened to it, of an emancipated slave holding up the Emancipation Proclamation. And you see these very dignified African-American men and women and children dressed to their finest, very proudly participating as American citizens in this centennial. Okay, but it doesn't end there. So within a few weeks, literally, of Grant leaving the White House, he hops on a steamer and goes around the world for a year and a half, travels the entire planet, visits 27 nations, and what's he doing? He's spreading the fabric that's destined to cover the surface of the globe. He's saying, we won this battle against slavery, this battle for human development. You can do the same. He meets with Bismarck, he meets with Alexander II of Russia, he meets with Li Hongchang in China. He spent a lot of time in Japan, and you can see all these other countries that he visited. So that's the fabric beginning to cover the surface of the globe, right? So the American system is being exported to Germany, Russia, France, Japan, China, Mexico, Colombia. So you might say to yourself, what happened? And Helga addressed that. What happened is the oligarchy, the British, counterattacked, and they just started killing everybody. They murdered 3 presidents in 35 years. You talk about traumatic, right? Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley. The same time they killed Garfield, who was a pro-American system president, they killed Tsar Alexander II. And all of these other leaders, generally with this inclination. So it was a murder spree. And in the United States, they basically organized a coup, which we'll hear more about from our friend, Mr. Chaitkin, which put this creep, Teddy Roosevelt, the Anglo race patriot, Teddy Roosevelt, in the White House, and revived the Ku Klux Klan, all the horrible things that people say now were the entirety of the United States, right? This was revived, fortunately, by this tradition by Franklin Roosevelt, who was very explicit to Churchill, no more colonies, it's over, forget about it. Roosevelt, of course, dies, and then they bring in this whole Cold War BS to break up what otherwise would be the 2 countries that would be girdling the globe with the tramway of iron, which would be in a different world right now. Kennedy revived this in a certain way. That's him with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who I didn't know was in Chester, Pennsylvania, which is pretty amazing. But Kennedy was known as a senator. If you came from Africa, you went straight to Senator Kennedy's office because he was the anti-colonial senator in the United States. Anyway, it's a whole other story. That's a great book, by the way, if you want to read it, Strategy of Peace. And the man that revived this entire thing over 40 to 50 years was Lyndon LaRouche, who picked up the pieces, advanced the economics of it, and he wrote development plans for India, Africa, Ibero-America, Latin America, the Pacific Basin. He and Helga came up with the idea of the Eurasian land bridge. These pictures are of him all over the world. And that's what he did. And I concur with Diane. I mean, this is one of the tragic events of the past 50 years, was the treatment of this great inheritor of the American mission, treated as a criminal in his own country. And that will change with President Diane Sare.
Our next speaker is new, and the topic is asymmetric warfare. Now, I recognize him. Asymmetric warfare, maybe he means what we did here 30 years ago on July 4th, when Louis Farrakhan and Lyndon LaRouche spoke on the same platform, the First District Plaza in Philadelphia. There were 1,000 people there approximately. And I referred to it, Lynn liked it, as the monster movie double feature. Now, this meeting was convened by someone by the name of the Reverend James Bevel. And James Bevel had started an organization called the Declaration of Independence Co-Signers Convention. The reason that Bevel started this is he said, I think the problem in the United States is not really with what we're trying to do. I don't think it's our organizing. He said, I think it's that the people of the United States may not agree with the Declaration of Independence. I mean, they may have simply agreed that they will be subjects, they'll be slaves. So maybe what we ought to do is organize a co-signers convention where they all have to sign on. So he is a person that convened this. He also ran for vice president with Lyndon LaRouche, but the reason that he was around at all is because of the next speaker. And he was not going to get away with me not introducing him this way, because he is directly responsible for me having to spend 3 straight years with James Bevel. Some of you may think that is an honor. Let's put it this way. It's a good example all the way around of asymmetric warfare, including against your friends. So it is my honor, if you were to put it that way, or I'm very happy at least, to introduce Steve Douglas, who is speaking on asymmetric warfare in the American Revolution.
Bill would have a lot to say, that's for sure. So as Dennis indicated, I'll be speaking on asymmetric warfare and the birth of the American Republic. Let me start with a question. What is the greatest threat to its continued existence and well-being that confronts the United States of America today, 250 years after its birth? Is it a military threat, especially including a nuclear threat, emanating from China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, or some other so-called rogue state? Donald Trump, Secretary of War Hegseth, Bibi Netanyahu, and the many members of the Anglo-American military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned the American people about on January 17, 1961, in his nationwide farewell address all would like you to believe so. But that is hardly the case. In point of fact, the greatest threat to the continued existence of the United States does not emanate from any foreign military establishment. Rather, it emanates quite simply from the American people's woeful ignorance of their own history. If the American people were imbued with an organic appreciation of America's extraordinary history, they would never tolerate the imperial conduct that has come to be the hallmark of activities in Washington, D.C. today. King George III, whom George Washington and Benjamin Franklin defeated in the American Revolutionary War, must be gleefully dancing in his royal mausoleum today at the sight of the USA implementing a global imperialist policy that he would be glad and proud to call his very own. With that sad state of current affairs in mind, let us review over the next few minutes a condensed summary of how the United States was brought into being so that we might contribute to its rebirth on the occasion of its 250th anniversary. It was by means of what today is referred to as asymmetric warfare that the United States was brought into being. Asymmetrical warfare involves conflicts where opposing sides have drastically different military capabilities. To compensate for its logistical, material, financial, and weaponry disadvantages, the apparently weaker party is prompted to rely on two factors. The first is the application of new and/or unconventional tactics and systems. Such tactics, systems as guerrilla warfare, cyber warfare, drone warfare, or hypersonic rockets that are produced and launched from underground sites that are undetectable by opposition satellites, are exemplary. The second factor involves the making of alliances and pacts of cooperation with political forces and/or nations that desire to see that the imperial overreach of the larger, stronger warring party is constrained and limited. The psychological states of the opposing forces of the forces and the population of these countries are of paramount, if not decisive, strategic significance in any asymmetrical conflict. The conduct of the Iranian population today exemplifies the truth of that statement. 20th and 21st century examples of asymmetrical warfare include the Vietnam War from 1955 to 75, the Soviet-Afghan War from 79 to 89, and the U.S.-Afghan War from 2001 to 2021, and of course the ongoing Israeli and U.S. conflict with Iran at this moment. The first shots of the American Revolution were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts on April 19, 1775. But the fuse to the Revolutionary War was arguably lit in 1750 with the passage of the Iron Act by the British Parliament. This act expressly forbade the British colonies in North America from engaging in the construction of any new iron forges or iron-related production facilities. The colonies were to provide raw materials to the mother country, period. They were not to develop independent manufacturing capabilities involving iron. The denial of the scientifically vectored research and economic development amounts to the essence of the denial to any country of its inherent right to the realization of sovereign, independent political existence. That, it should be noted, is the real issue behind the nuclear hysteria that has been manufactured by the U.S. and Israel about Iran today. Are they really concerned about nuclear weapons? Or are they more concerned about nuclear technologies and development, the likes of which they see having spread through China and elsewhere around the world with the Belt and Road Initiative? The U.S. imperial campaign to prevent Iran from participating in China's Belt and Road infrastructure development projects amounts to a 21st century carbon copy of the British Empire's Iron Act of 1750. And that's the sad story of America today. We have become the British Empire of this century. We have become an institution which represents the very policies against which the founding fathers conducted their revolution. Lest you have any doubts about the British intent with respect to its North American colonial subjects, consider what Britain was doing with and to India in the 1750s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and all the way into the 20th century. The destruction of India's large world-class manufacturing sector intensified in 1757 after the British won the Battle of Plassey and the British East India Company assumed control of Bengal on the Indian subcontinent. The elimination of protective tariffs and the imposition of onerous internal taxes that discouraged economic activity between domestic enterprises effectively deindustrialized the Indian subcontinent. As the chairman of the board of the British East India Company proudly boasted in his testimony to the English Parliament in 1840, this company has succeeded in converting India from a manufacturing country into a country that exports raw produce. That's what he announced with pride to the British Parliament. In an article entitled How British Colonialism Killed 100 Million Indians in 40 Years, authors Dylan Sullivan and Jason Hickel document, quote, somewhere in the vicinity of 100 million people died prematurely in India at the height of British colonialism. This is among the largest policy-induced mortality crises in human history. Between 1880 and 1920, the Indian death rates increased by 19%, and life expectancy decreased by 18%. A study done by historian Robert C. Allen has documented that poverty skyrocketed under British rule in India from 23% in 1810 to more than 50% in the middle of the 20th century. Now, here's a history question for you. Here's your quiz for today. Who, outside of Winston Churchill, was perhaps the most enthusiastic admirer of British colonial methods as they were applied in India? If you guessed Adolf Hitler, you were right. You know your history. Adolf Hitler conducted meetings with his top fellow criminals, and Albert Speer, Goebbels, had the wisdom, since he was there at a lot of these meetings when the top Nazis got together and figured out how is things going. Hitler was completely manic in the first months of the war against Russia because the Wehrmacht was moving across Russia. He expected that Russia was going, or USSR, was going to surrender at any moment. So he would talk to his top advisors or minions in these late evening talks. And a book was written on this called Table Talk with Hitler. How's that for something to give you an indigestion? So the record of what Hitler was thinking at these different points is just beyond description. But from the Table Talk diaries, you have the following. What Hitler said over and over again was that he intended to manage the affairs of the Soviet Union that he believed would soon be surrendering to him in the same way that the British ran their empire in India. Hitler said on July 27, 1941, quote, "It should be possible for us to control this region to the east with 250,000 men plus a cadre of good administrators. Let's learn from the English, who with 250,000 men in all, including only 50,000 soldiers, govern 400 million subjects in India today. Nothing," said Hitler, "would be a worse mistake on our part than to seek to educate the masses there. Nothing. At present, they cannot read, and they ought to stay like that. That's the strength of the English, to allow the natives to live whilst they exploit them to the uttermost. That's Hitler admiring British conduct in the 1940s, even as he's bombing London. As for Winston Churchill, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a member of the Indian Parliament, an historian and an author of some renown, stated in 2017 that, quote, Churchill has as much blood on his hands as Hitler does, particularly the decisions that he personally signed off on during the Bengal famine of 1943, when 4.3 million people died because of the decisions he took or endorsed. So this is in 1943 in World War II. Such was the murderous outlook and the murderous intent and effect of British colonial policy. Contrast that homicidal imperial looting outlook with the agapic developmental vision that permeated the outlook of Benjamin Franklin. Now here I have to beg your indulgence for a moment. You've already heard a number of these quotes, but it won't with what David Shaven presented this morning, I heard a whole chunk of my presentation because he's quoting from what I was quoting from his article that had appeared in Fidelio a long time ago on the question of Benjamin Franklin and his orientation. The reason this is important, and it's worth hearing again, this is the way leaders in America thought at its inception. This is what drove Franklin, Washington, and others to conspire to create that great nation that we became at one point. So what Franklin did when he was in England in August of 1771, not long after Captain Cook's historic exploratory expedition had returned to England from New Zealand, Franklin wrote and circulated a proposal entitled An Introduction to a Plan for Benefiting New Zealanders. So here are a few of my quotes, some of which overlap what David said. Quote, Britain is now the first maritime power in the world. Her ships are innumerable, capable by their form, size, and strength of sailing all the seas. The inhabitants of those other countries, our fellow men, have canoes only. Not knowing iron, they cannot build ships. They cannot therefore come to us. From these circumstances, does not some duty seem to arise from us to them? Does not Providence, by these distinguishing favors, seem to call upon us to do something ourselves for the common interests of humanity? To shower good things over all is divine. Many voyages have been undertaken with views of profit or of plunder, or to gratify resentment, to procure some advantage to ourselves, or to do some mischief to others. But a voyage is now proposed to visit a distant people on the other side of the globe, not to cheat them, not to rob them, not to seize their land, not to enslave them, but merely to do them good. What kind of idea is that? Why would you ever want to merely do the good? Are you nuts? So what he went on to say is, it seems a laudable wish that nations of the earth were connected by a knowledge of each other in a mutual exchange of benefits. We may therefore hope in this undertaking to be of some service to our country, as well as to those poor people who, however distant from us, are in truth related to us, and whose interests do in some degree concern everyone who can say, homo sum, or I am a human. So that is the essence of the beauty of the American development. This is what we represented at our best. And it is so shameful to look at America's conduct today. by way of contrast. Such was the agapic statesman-like outlook of Benjamin Franklin, the polar opposite of the Zions of the British Empire. Their priority was imperial and financial. Debt reduction in the aftermath of the British defeat of France in the 7 Years' War that ended in 1763. So on March 22nd, 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which for the first time taxed items and activities that emanated from within the North American colonies. Beginning November 1st, 1765, to be printed on British-produced paper, all legal documents in the colonies, including academic degrees, appointments to office, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, and even dice, required embossing with a treasury stamp as proof of the payment of the tax by the colonials to Britain. Since the colonies were denied any form of representation in the British Parliament, their reaction to the tax was visceral in the extreme. That reaction prompted the Parliament to grudgingly repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. Over the next 8 years, the British Parliament enacted a blizzard of legislative measures that were designed to repress the expanding colonial opposition to its imperial monetary extraction policies. In the aftermath of the famous Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773, when angry colonists dumped more than 46 tons of tea from the ships of the British East India Company into the Boston Harbor, the British Parliament enacted the infamous 4 coercive acts, which were also called the Intolerable Acts, between March 31st and June 2nd, 1774. These acts were designed to punish the Massachusetts colony and to contain rebellious colonial activity more generally. Lord North, the Prime Minister in 1774, declared, "Boston has been the ringleader of all violence and opposition to the execution of the laws of this country. Boston has not only therefore to answer for its own violence, but for having incited other places to similar kinds of destruction and tumult." Now, think about that reasoning for a minute. Boston inspired wrongdoing elsewhere. They're going to pay for everybody. Is that the form of reasoning? Is that form of reasoning not identical to the 21st century line of propaganda that declares that Iran is the world's leading sponsor of terrorism and should be punished accordingly? Any problem anywhere in the world, pin it in 2026 on Iran. In 1774, pin it on Boston, pin it on Massachusetts. With the coercive acts, Parliament repealed Massachusetts' longstanding charter, dissolved the elected assembly, and limited each town and village in the colony to just one town meeting a year. Some people might not like meetings, but that's still no reason. Additionally, the Port of Boston was closed until all its residents paid in full for the tea that had been destroyed by the Boston Tea Party. The price was nearly 5 British pounds per taxpayer, which amounted to more than a month of wages for a good craftsman in those days. British officers were also empowered to commandeer vacant homes and barns to quarter their troops under these acts. And finally, the Parliament appointed General Thomas Gage to assume the role of governor of Massachusetts. He assumed that role in addition to the fact that he was already the commander-in-chief of all British armed forces in America. They tasked him with enforcing these new acts and ending Boston's resistance to the Crown's dictates. Gage and 4 fresh regiments of troops set sail for Boston in mid-April 1774. How is that for a sterling example of 18th century regime change? Because that's what it is. And apparently, some of the geniuses in the Department of War must have read, well, gee, didn't that work for the British against the Boston colonists? Let's do the same thing in Iran. If you look at what's going on, every single blunder that the British made in trying to suppress the rebellion in the United States is exactly what Trump and friends are doing today. He's probably going to get a special degree from Oxford when he leaves office. So after, with the imposition of the coercive acts, a spectacular phenomenon was unleashed in the colonies. It galvanized and unified colonial resistance to British looting and dictatorial decrees. It prompted the convening of the First Continental Congress, where representatives of 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia between September 5th and October 26, 1774, to map out a potent, coordinated response to the coercive, intolerable acts. Whereas the British intended to punish, repress, demoralize, and dominate their North American colonial subjects with the imposition of these coercive acts, their campaign of repression produced precisely the opposite of the intended effect. The British campaign of repression unified the 13 separate colonies as never before, just as the American imperial bombing campaign against Iran unified disparate factions in that country to an extent not seen in decades. It was painfully apparent from the outset of the war on April 19, 1775, that the 13 colonies could not defeat the British Empire by themselves. Britain had the largest navy in the world and a formidable army that drew from the 8 million people that lived in Britain. Plus, they had mercenaries such as the Hessians from mainland Europe. North American colonies had a population of only 2,500,000, 500,000 of whom were slaves. The colonies had no navy and initially only colonial militias to staff their land forces. Furthermore, historians estimate that as much as 20% of the colonial population at that time were Tories who were loyal to Britain. Such were the circumstances as Benjamin Franklin departed for France on October 26, 1776, just under 4 months after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He would remain there until July of 1785, laboring as the premier diplomat of the American cause to recruit the French to the effort to defeat the British. While the French initially received Franklin's efforts with great respect, they hesitated to conclude any formal arrangements with the American colonials until the Americans could prove and demonstrate at least a minimum level of competence on the field of battle against the British redcoats. That is exactly what happened, finally, with the colonials accomplished at the Battle of Saratoga between September 19th and October 17th of 1777. The American forces there defeated the 8,000-man British force of General John Burgoyne. News of Burgoyne's surrender echoed wildly throughout the corridors of power in Europe, and most especially in Paris. On February 6, 1778, France signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the colonies. In doing so, it formally recognized American independence from Britain, acknowledged the United States as an independent sovereign nation, and granted the United States a most favored nation trading status. At the same time, the French signed a separate treaty of alliance with the newborn United States that specified the details of a military and defensive agreement between the two countries. The geometry of the conflict was thereby completely transformed with the French signing these two treaties. What had been an internal squabble between a pesky colony like Massachusetts and a seemingly all-powerful imperial master had morphed into a civilization-altering existential conflict. This, of course, is exactly what we're witnessing today in the transformation of the Trump-misled USA and the Netanyahu-misled Israeli combined assault on Iran. And so it was that a redesigned and reorganized French fleet commanded by Admiral de Grasse defeated the British fleet commanded by Lord Graves in the Battle of the Chesapeake Bay on September 5th, 1781. Admiral de Grasse thereby prevented the British from reinforcing and resupplying General Cornwallis, who was subsequently placed under siege by General Washington at Yorktown on September 28th. Cornwallis's surrender on October 19th, 1781, effectively ended the war. It's important to note in conclusion that what George Washington identified as the most dangerous threat to the success of the colonials' fight for independence from British imperial tyranny. He spoke of this danger to Joseph Reed, chief executive of Pennsylvania, a lawyer and a military officer. In a letter that was dated December 12, 1778, Washington wrote, "This tribe of black gentry," and by that he meant financial speculators, "this tribe of black gentry work more efficiently against us than the enemy's arms and are 100 times more dangerous to our liberties and the great cause we are engaged in. It gives me sincere pleasure to find that there is likely to be a coalition so well disposed to second your endeavors in bringing these murderers of our cause, the speculators, the monopolizers, the forestallers, the engrossers, to appropriate punishment. It is much to be lamented that each state long before this has not hunted them down as the pests of society that they are, and the greatest enemies we face in the fight for happiness in America. I would to God that one of the most atrocious of each state was hung in the gibbets upon the gallows 5 times as high as the one prepared by Haman. No punishment, in my opinion, is too great for the man who can build his greatness upon his country's ruin." Now, note, Haman was an Old Testament oligarch who built a 50-foot high gallows with the intent of lynching his Jewish enemies. Oops, he was the one lynched instead on his own 50-foot high gallows. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously echoed Washington's sentiment on the threat of the money power represented to the American people in his message to Congress on curbing monopolies that he delivered on the 29th of April, 1938. Therein, he stated that the first truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in essence, is fascism. Ownership of a government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling power who happen to have $3 trillion or more to buy things with. That was not included there. Are we not witnessing the predominance of precisely such concentrations of power around Wall Street and Washington, D.C. today? And the answer is sadly yes. But we have these founding fathers whom we're hearing of this weekend to thank for certain perspectives that we can operate on. But what can an American citizen do about all this? Support and join the presidential campaign of Diane Sare. There is no candidate whose knowledge of American and world history is even remotely comparable to her mastery of these subjects. It is high time that the USA stopped monetizing ignorance. Thank you.
That's good stuff. That's good stuff. All right. Our next speaker needs no introduction. He is the independent candidate from the 15th Congressional District of New York State, otherwise known as the Bronx. And he is here to speak on the subject of the American Revolution and Gouverneur Morris.
Okay, very good. And then let me just set something here. So first of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you for letting me come here. I first found out about Gouverneur Morris kind of late in my life, actually in my late teens. It was actually during COVID. When COVID first broke out in 2020, there was a lot of discussion about the Morris burial site. He's buried in the Bronx on the corner of St. Anne's and 138th Street in a church called St. Anne's Church. It is in the heart of the South Bronx, which people today call the poorest congressional district in the entire country. And statistically, it is the poorest congressional district in the entire country, and it's where I'm a candidate for Congress in. I just ran in the Democratic primary, and I'm also an independent candidate in it as well. And the way in which we treat that burial site, that neighborhood as a whole, is a reflection of how the American people think about the founding of this country and what it actually stands for. And I believe that there was an intentional destruction of both the neighborhood and the roots of the Constitution. See, a lot of people don't actually know the name Gouverneur Morris. A lot of people don't even know that he was the penman of it. I'll get into it in a bit, but basically there was this committee that was put together towards the end of the convention called the Committee of Styles. And the idea was, okay, we just, had these months where we were deliberating on what's going to be in the Constitution, who's actually going to put this thing pen to paper, who's going to actually put the language together. So it was Morris and a group of 5 people who actually did it. But before I fast forward my presentation, let's actually just get into it on who Gouverneur Morris was and his role in the Constitution and the American Revolution. And let's first talk about his roots. A lot of the Bronx today is called Morrisania. There's Morris Heights, there's Gouverneur Street, there's a whole bunch of references to Gouverneur Morris in the Bronx. See, he actually comes, his great-grandparents, Robert Morris and Sarah Pole Morris, there's no pictures of them that I could find, so I just put question marks over them. They were actually Welsh. They came from Wales, and we know that, there's a Welsh person in there, you go. We know that Robert Morris had actually served in Cromwell's army. And then him and his brother bought a lot of land in Barbados. No Barbadians in the room? And then Robert Morris married Sarah Pole Morris. She was an heiress. She was pretty rich herself, so he accumulated more wealth, and they came to New York, the United States, and they had bought a lot of land in what is now known as the Bronx. And then they had a lot of kids. One of them was Lewis Morris, who was the 8th governor of colonial New Jersey, and then he had a lot of kids. Lewis Morris Jr., who was in the New York Assembly in the early 1730s. He was also the Speaker of the Assembly as well. There's a lot there that we could get into, and we won't. So back to Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris attends what is now known as Columbia University, was King College then, when he's only 12 years old. Now, that does sound pretty impressive, and it is impressive. It's the equivalent of like a 16-year-old today going to a college, right? Now, a few years later, this would be when revolution talk starts happening. And you have to understand that Morris comes from a family that is staunchly, political and rich, and, they come from a very up social class. They basically own the Bronx. And this would be a test for the Morris family, because Gouverneur Morris himself supported independence, despite the fact that his older half-brother, Stats Morris, would become a general for the British Army. And he was a loyalist. Even his own mother was a loyalist as well. And when the British occupied New York, she would even let them occupy the Morris estate. Now, his older half-brother, also a Lewis Morris, would become a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Morris was also he played a pivotal role in the American Revolution. He actually was tasked he was on a congressional committee that was sent to Valley Forge to meet with General George Washington and investigate the condition of the Continental Army. And so he wrote, "Our troops, miseros, That means our poor men, our poor wretched men. The skeleton of an army presents itself to our eyes in a naked, starving condition, out of health, out of spirits. But I have seen Fort George in the summer of 1777. He's writing this in February 1778. Next campaign, I believe we shall banish these troublesome fellows. And he goes on into the letter to talk about that he believes that the reason why the Continental Army is in the state it's in, why the British are taking these victories, is actually not because the British are so good and bad. He's looking at the Continental Army with a very sober look. And he's saying it's actually our fault. It's our side's fault. We are mismanaging how we're collecting revenue. We're mismanaging how we're ordering our troops. And he was also pretty optimistic that we'll be able to fix it. And he knew that this wasn't because God wanted us to lose. He knew that the error of what was happening to the troops was because of human error. And therefore, it could be fixed with a human solution. And so now, we would win the revolution and thus would become the very exciting part of what I had actually looked into, which is the Constitutional Convention. Now, this is the most consequential convention of our nation. People talk about July 4th, 1776. This is related to what comes after. After reading some passages and diaries from July 4th, 1776, there was a sense of, well, what now? What do we do now? And that's what this convention was supposed to do. What will be our nation? You have to realize that from the surrender of 1781 up until this Constitutional Convention, there was no constitution. There were still Articles of Confederation. These people saw themselves as states, independent governments, and the conditions were pretty bad. Now, what you would see in the following passages that I'll quote from Morris is a spirit of intervention. A spirit of somebody who decided to stand up and speak his mind because he saw what was happening was wrong. So this first quote is, these quotes are coming from Madison's journal. And let me just put a quick disclaimer here before I read this. Madison, despite what some historians may tell you, was not a fan of Morris philosophically. And so you have to keep that in mind as well, although some people argue he did his best to stay neutral in his recollection of what was happening in the Constitutional Convention. Now, just before I read this quote, what's happening is that they're convening and they're talking about how are we going to represent people? And they come back and they say, okay, for every 40,000 people in a given state, they'll be given a representative. And if they have less than 40,000 people in a state, every state is guaranteed at least one member in what would become the House of Representatives, and every state would have 2 senators. Now, Morris had actually objected to this, but first he starts by saying, this is Madison describing what Morris had said. This says, in July 5th, 1787, he came here as a representative of America. This is Morris. He flattered himself. He came here in some degree as a representative of the whole human race. For the whole human race will be affected by the proceedings of this convention. He wished gentlemen to extend their views beyond the present moment of time, beyond the narrow limits of place from which they derive their political origin. The reason he starts by saying that is because he says, gentlemen, we cannot just allow the representatives of these various states think that they are only representing their states. We can't just have a government, a federal government that's composed of, well, I represent, Massachusetts and you represent Virginia, so I'm going to do what's in the best interest of my state. You're going to do what's in the best interest of your state, and whatever, we can come up with that is good for both of us, then we can agree on that. He opposed that. He hated that idea. In fact, you could even argue it's one of the reasons why we have the problems we have now. One of the, I have this policy called the Space Civilian Construction Corps, which would ultimately redesign and redevelop and reindustrialize New York City, the Bronx, and make it a starting point for the rest of the country. And one piece of criticism I was given was, well, why should a senator in Michigan, South Dakota, approve federal funds for a project in New York City? Morris, of course, would have objected to that line of thinking, saying, how about you think about the whole country as a whole? And my answer would be that the steel that would be manufactured in New York City and the Bronx and other places, and the people that we educate and develop, will benefit the whole nation, because that's where we'll build our cities from. Regardless, let's continue on here. July 11th, 1787. Now we're really getting into the roots of, well, what does representation mean? And this is when we start seeing this idea of, well, how do we count slaves? And this is where the infamous 3/5 clause will come from. But basically, Morris is being presented all these arguments. Well, the South, we rely on slavery as our economy, as our market. And Morris has this great response. This is again Madison quoting Morris. Mr. Morris was reduced to the dilemma of doing injustice to the Southern states or to human nature, and he must therefore do it to the former. Now, I really like that, because he's saying, like, do we put down the Southern states or all of humanity? That's a tough one. But ultimately, he decides, as we saw in what he said 6 days ago, he's thinking of himself as a representative of humanity. And then now this is one of Morris's most famous rebukes of slavery. This is August 8th, 1787. He says, Mr. Morris says, he would never concur in upholding domestic slavery. It was a nefarious institution. Now Madison was also apparently anti-slavery too, which is probably why he was very favorable in this quote. Anyway, he would never concur in upholding domestic slavery. It was a nefarious institution. It was the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Compare the free regions of the Middle States, where a rich and noble cultivation marks the prosperity and happiness of the people, with the misery and poverty which overspread the barren wastes of Virginia, Maryland, and the other states having slaves. Now, I think the bottom is a direct quote of what Morris said. He said, travel through ye whole continent, and you behold the prospect continually varying with the appearance and disappearance of slavery. The moment you leave ye eastern states and enter New York, the effects of the institution become visible. Passing through the Jerseys and entering Pennsylvania, every criterion of superior improvement witnesses the change. But proceed southwardly, and every step you take through ye great regions of slaves presents a desert, increasing with the increasing proportion of these wretched beings. Now, I really like that, because back in 1787, he's calling these states that use slavery as deserts. This is a precursor to the Oasis Plan, because what made the North work was the development, the ingenuity, the increase of infrastructure, which I won't get into now, but New York and the eastern states were seen as some of the advances of modern infrastructure. That was the Oasis Plan back then, and we still have desert cities now. This is just more of what he goes through in his rebuke against slavery. I won't read this now. Jonathan Crook isn't here. He did a great recitation of this at a concert recently in New York. It's the one where he says, upon what principle is it that the slave shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in this city are worth more than all the wretched slaves which cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. So basically, I want to end on one point now, because Morris, at the convention at least, didn't win on the basis of, that we were going to ban slavery with the ratification and adoption of what would be in the Constitution. He didn't win on his argument on proportion and how representation should be proportionated, but he was given an opportunity to be on the Committee of Style. Now, this would mean that there was a brief discussion on should there be a preamble. And up until that point, for the last 300-400 years, it seemed to be customary that whenever you had a legal text, you always had some kind of preamble, some introduction, something that sort of told you what was in the legal document. Now, the first draft of the preamble was this: we, the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, do ordain, declare, and establish the following Constitution for the government of ourselves and our posterity. Efficient. Great. Now, that would only last about 4 or 5 days. And knowing Morris, who actually hated this line of thinking, would change it to what it is today. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution in the United States of America. Now, as we look at today, we do see that there are many desert cities. If you go to South Dakota today, there's just a whole bunch of land that isn't being used. The last modern city that we developed, I believe, was Las Vegas. And even though many of the founding fathers and many legal scholars like to say that, well, you know, this preamble bears no real legal significance and therefore has no power, Morris felt right to intervene and make sure that this was included. In fact, there was opposition. Patrick Henry had said, well, what gives them the right to say we the people? It should say we the states. He said that famously at the ratification of the Constitution at the Virginia Convention. And Hamilton would actually use the preamble in one of his Federalist papers, which he wrote under a pseudonym to argue against the Bill of Rights. He said, why do we need to detail people's rights? It's all in the preamble. You know, why do we need to enumerate these things, right? See, so this one preamble is the true idea of what the United States is supposed to be, because the Constitution can change. It has changed. It has changed a number of times. There is a power in it to change itself and adopt to whatever it needs to be. And Morris saw that. And the next continuation of that has to be us. We have to continue to operate in that basis, in that idea of a more perfect union. And that's why I'm proud to be here supporting my friend Diane Sare for president. So.
Our next speaker is Richard Freeman, and he has amended his title in the spirit of the Constitutional Convention. He has called his presentation Lincoln's Economic Miracle, or The President Who Taught Shakespeare, Burns, and Poe to America.
In the period of his presidency, from March 1861 through April 1865, Abraham Lincoln, a student of Henry Carey and supporter of Henry Clay, both advocates of the American system, took over the American presidency in perhaps the harshest conditions any person before or since ever has. Yet he accomplished not only the defeat of the British-centered, financed, and directed Confederate slaveholders' insurrection, preserved and expanded the Union, and began the decisive eradication of the barbaric Nazi-like institution of black slavery with his January 1st, 1863 Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. But he also led an economic miracle. In a January 12, 2002 article, Lyndon LaRouche, the greatest physical economist to ever live, wrote, with the guidance and backing of the world's leading economist of that time, Henry C. Carey, President Abraham Lincoln made possible the U.S. economic miracle of 1861 through 1876. Most Americans do not know that miracle exists or what it is. I'm here to tell you what it is, selecting a few critical features about it. This presentation will emphasize that this miracle occurred, like all growth has occurred throughout history, as an economic shockwave, as described by Lyndon LaRouche. I will demonstrate that here. This is an actual picture of a plane. When an object, such as a jet plane, travels at a speed below the speed of sound, which is 760 miles per hour, there are certain physical laws, so-called, that govern its behavior. But when an object travels faster through the air than the speed of sound, the object outruns the sound, and the pressure waves pile up into one massive, powerful, abrupt shock. From the ground, we hear this as a sonic boom. LaRouche says that the old laws no longer apply. We enter a new domain. Think of this like a series of generated conical waves that pass over the back of the plane, with each conical wave representing an economic platform, having a higher scientific set of principles and power, and a higher power of reason, superseded by a new wave governed by even higher principles and power. That is what Lincoln's economic miracle accomplished. I would add in support of Mr. LaRouche that this was sustained with interruptions until the year 1900. There are two features that accomplished this. The American system of economics, which you have heard about this afternoon. In 1832, running as a candidate from Sangamon County for the Illinois House of Representatives, Lincoln stated, "My politics are short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. I am in favor of a national bank. I am in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff. These are my sentiments and political principles." But as superb as this is, this would not have worked without a quality of Lincoln, his poetical soul. Lincoln taught William Shakespeare, Bobby Burns, and Edgar Poe to his cabinet, to his generals, to the U.S. Congress, and to America. Lincoln read and could recite largely from memory, in particular Shakespeare's Macbeth, Hamlet, Richard III, King Lear, Henry VI, Henry VIII, Julius Caesar, and the Merchant of Venice. In the spring of 1862, Lincoln visited the Union Army along the Potomac River. U.S. Secretary of War Edward Stanton and Secretary of Treasury Salmon Chase were present, and Union General Egbert Vila, who was part of the party, reported about Lincoln, quote, "With a mind well stored with the grandest and most beautiful in English literature, and a memory so wonderful he could repeat almost word for word whatever he read, he would sit for hours during the trip, repeating the finest passages of Shakespeare's best plays," end quote. Lincoln loved and recited Bobby Burns' Republican poem, "A Man's a Man for All That," in Gaelic accent. On long rides, he recited by heart to his company Edgar Poe's The Raven. Why is this important? The plays allowed him to think deeply about leadership. What is tyranny? And with Lady Macbeth, what is blind, unreasoning ambition and evil? But as the poet Percy Shelley says, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Lincoln had only 12 months of formal education. Poetry was the only English language he knew. Lincoln lived in the realm of metaphor, the creative mind. He wrote poetically. He could see problems that his generals like George McClellan, Fighting Joe Hooker, George Meade, and others couldn't even see, and Lincoln solved them, directing the war. Lincoln had a vision beyond his cabinet and the Congress, and he led them to that vision. Poetry infused his soul and gave him his character. Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave, and great American, who locked horns with Lincoln many times, including in his 1876 oration on Lincoln, said in an 1880 tribute of Lincoln, "A great man, tender of heart, strong of nerve, of boundless patience and broadest sympathies, with no motive apart from his country. He could receive counsel from a child and give counsel to a sage. The simple approached him with ease. Take him for all in all, Abraham Lincoln was one of the noblest, wisest, and best men I ever knew. The shockwave. With respect to the ordered shockwaves, the U.S. Congress in 1862 passed a series of pieces of intermeshed legislation that supported each other and that, taken together as a unit, is among the most powerful ever. I call the 1862 Congress the Alexander Hamilton Congress. First, look at Hamiltonian credit. In 1832, President Andrew Jackson treasonously dismantled the American system that had been erected by the previous president, John Quincy Adams. 4 years before the Hamiltonian Second Bank of the United States was scheduled to be rechartered in 1836, Jackson destroyed the bank by announcing he would refuse to recharter it and ordering the withdrawal of federal deposits from the bank to leave it without any money to function with. Jackson launched the era of wildcat banking. A person with almost no credit could set up a bank, provided he bought some state bonds and could convince a state banking representative to allow him to operate. The banks were state chartered. By 1861, when Lincoln took office, there were 1,400 state-chartered wildcat banks. There were about 7,500 different currencies, each issued by a state bank. Many currencies were counterfeit or worthless. Lincoln and the Republican Party, which controlled the Congress now that the seceding Confederate states had walked out, proposed 2 large bond issues to fund the costly war. The first was the 520 bond, a 20-year bond paying 6% annual interest, which were issued in February of 1862, but also throughout the war, raising between $500 and $600 million. Pro-American, Philadelphia-based investment banker Jay Cooke had 2,500 sub-agents to sell the bonds directly to the American public, an amazing response by the American Republic. The government also issued 3-year U.S. government bonds paying 7.3%, issued in the amount of $830 million. These too were sold by the Cooke system. The U.S. government also issued a progressive income tax, an excise tax, and tariffs to raise money. As a result of the wildcat banking, the U.S. still did not have a sovereign currency. In February 1862, explicitly pro-Alexander Hamilton banker Elbridge Gerry Spaulding, a congressman from Buffalo, New York, introduced the Legal Tender Act. This introduced a U.S. currency that paid no interest and thus was a non-interest-bearing loan to the United States government. It was not convertible into gold. The first act issued $150 million, and 2 subsequent issues issued another $300 million, for a total of $450 million in only 14 months. It was issued to soldiers and war material providers as pay, but then could circulate among merchants, businessmen, and farmers. The $450 million legal tender notes, called greenbacks because the backside of the note was green, tripled the U.S. currency supply in only 14 months and expanded productive activity greatly. Lyndon LaRouche strongly favored this because it was issued and controlled by the United States government and not a private bank. It restored sovereignty to the U.S. dollar. There were other measures to force the closure of wildcat banks in the 1864 and 1865 Banking Acts, which will be covered elsewhere. The Transcontinental Railway. The second superlative measure from the 1862 Hamilton Congress was the Pacific Railway, to build the first transcontinental railway which would connect the nation and touch off several self-organized shockwaves. Lincoln was personally involved in the process, as on August 13, 1859, he met the exceptional railroad engineer Grenville Dodge for 2 hours in Council Bluff, Iowa, where, as Dodge said in his recollections, Lincoln got all the best information from Dodge on the best route for a transcontinental railway, which Dodge had already surveyed. 3 years later, on July 1st, 1862, Lincoln as president signed the Pacific Railway Act into law. As the map shows, look at the middle part of the map. There would be two railway companies. The first company, the Central Pacific, started in San Francisco, Sacramento, California, laying track and heading eastward. The second company, which started in Council Bluffs, Iowa, where Lincoln had met Dodge, went laying track westward. The project started in 1863, and between 20 and 25,000 men worked on the arduous and often engineering challenging project. The track of the two railway companies met 6 years later at Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10, 1869, and the rail lines were joined, forming a 1,912-mile rail line that was a marvel. Consider a few of the explosive effects. First, before the Pacific Railway construction, a trip from Council Bluffs, Iowa to Sacramento or San Francisco of a young man in good condition with horses and supplies took approximately 90 to 150 days, depending on the variables. The very first passenger train on the new transcontinental Pacific line took 4.25 days, a savings of time of 95 to 97%. Put another way, in terms of saving time, the railroad represents a growth in physical productivity of man's transportation of 3,500% at its utmost level, which changes the space-time relationship between man and nature. Second, counting the existing connecting railways from the East Coast to Council Bluffs, Iowa, which Bob Wesser mentioned earlier, the U.S. was now connected from coast to coast, realizing John Quincy Adams' positive conception of continental expansion. Third, now manufactured and agricultural goods could cross the nation, including coal, wheat, corn, metals. But in 1878, engineer Gustavus Swift and inventor Andrew Chase developed the first truly practical and widely used ice-cooled railcar. By the 1880s, the nation could now transport fruits, vegetables, and cut-up meats in ice-cooled insulated cars from California to Florida to Maine. Fourth, as the map shows, there were 5 transcontinental railways, not one, covering the different latitudes of the United States, and there grew up connecting routes going north and south. And the Northern Pacific, which is the northernmost one, and the Southern Pacific, which is the southernmost one, were both signed by Lincoln into law. So he signed 3 of these into law. Fifth, railroads are more than train routes. They form development corridors. This is a picture, it looks kind of strange, of an actual railroad land grant checkerboard. Under these acts, the U.S. government gave to the railroads grants of 1 square mile federal land, which are in red in the map. Notice that in this instance, the development corridor extends 20 miles on either side of the track. The railroads, to gain operating capital and pay off their loans, sold this land to the citizens, who bought them so they could be near the railroad. The citizens built farms, communities and cities, schools, and new production facilities. The cities of Omaha, Nebraska, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Denver, Colorado, and Chicago, Illinois, all blossomed as a result of being in a railroad development corridor. This is city building. This is civilization building. Sixth, in this table, you can see that the level of Class I railroad mileage in the United States rose from 30,000 miles in 1860 to 193,000 miles in 1900. This is a compounded annual growth rate of 13.4% for 40 years. If an economy grows by, say, 5% for, say, 7 or 8 years, that's pretty good. Railroad track miles grew by a compounded 13.4% year after year for 40 straight years. The U.S. government played the absolutely decisive dirigistic role in giving state-directed credit for the railroad building. While the private companies raised funds, the U.S. government floated $64 million in bonds, a very huge sum in those days, and then lent the bond money to the railroad companies to build the railways. They were 30-year loans. The government also gave the railroads 130 million acres of U.S. land, that's about 20,000 square miles, as a right of way, and for the railroad to purchase, as to sell, so that they could also have cash to pay off their bills. The railroads are the backbone of a shockwave explosion, improving the productivity of every square mile of the United States and of every citizen. The science driver of the railroads gave the impetus for the development of steel, and it was critical for building steel railroad tracks, steel bridges, and by the 1890s, steel locomotives to handle far heavier loads and travel at higher speeds. Other elements of the U.S. economy also required greater volumes of steel. After U.S. engineer Alexander Lyman Holley made critical technological improvements in the Bessemer steel process for the United States, steel production grew by leaps and bounds, from 17,000 tons produced in 1860 to 10 million tons in 1940, and eventually 141 million tons by 1969. So in the last 40 years of the 19th century, under the Lincoln economic miracle, the growth in steelmaking capacity was 17.8% per year. But the steel spinoff helped produce another spinoff. Steel dramatically helped with the reaper and the harvester, which worked much better with steel than with using the more brittle iron. Comparing 1830, before there was a reaper, to 1890 with the use of a steel reaper, a single farmer could harvest 7 times more bushels of wheat. Steel made farm implements more productive. Farm implements made the economy more productive. An advance in one field led to an advance in another field. As a crowning overview, this table shows in 1860, the U.S. had 140,000 manufacturing factories, which tripled to 513,000 in 1900, which, by the way, is 100,000 more than we have today. With the original work of André-Marie Ampère and Wilhelm Weber on the development of the science of electricity and electromagnetism, resulted in the development of commercially deliverable electricity in the 1880s by Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse. Another wave of the shock front took over. Lincoln did not invent electricity, but he did have a lot to do with the building of the railroads as a foundation and creating the directive environment of one invention leading to the creation of another. LaRouche noted that the Lincoln economic miracle, and Bob Wesser talked about this, was exported as a model to the Meiji Restoration in Japan, to Otto von Bismarck in Germany, and to Dmitry Mendeleev in Russia, where they used it. One cannot complete discussion of Lincoln without noting that the emancipation he issued on January 1st, 1863, was deliberately understated, but had a shocking effect. It stated, "Therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, do order and declare all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of the states are and henceforth forward shall be free, and that the executive of the United States, including the Navy and military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons." This ending of slavery and the economic miracle shockwave made, LaRouche stated, the United States the most powerful industrial economy on earth and restored its moral power in fulfilling the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Today, we need to deliberately create a self-developing economic shockwave and elicit the poetical soul of Abraham Lincoln. Join the campaign of Diane Sare.
Oh, that's the clicker. And our final speaker today on this panel is Anton Chaitkin, and this is his book, Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress, from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 1, 1750s to 1850s, and Tony will tell you about where he is on, I think he's on Volume 3 now. The topic here says, Teddy Roosevelt, Treason in America.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to talk to you. I'm going to give you some highlights from the third volume that I'm writing now. And I've already published 2 volumes of this trilogy. The topic here is the Theodore Roosevelt regime change, or coup d'etat. Next. So to introduce this, you have to go and see what it is they overthrew. We'll do that very briefly. There was a tradition that previous speakers, Rich was talking about, and the economic nationalists from the 19th century coming out of the Revolution, each one of them trying to renew the American Revolution. So in the late, in the 1880s, the late 1880s and the 1890s, a new generation of leadership, starting with Blaine and going to McKinley, took up this challenge, even though they were not the equal of Lincoln in terms of philosophically, but they took up the challenge of universal progress. And what they accomplished in this time through the 1890s was to realize the dream of Benjamin Franklin, that we now, with new powers of over nature and with new kinds of cooperation among developed countries, we had the power to uplift humanity that we never had before. We never had this physically and culturally possible. Next slide. So in the 1890s, the 2 preeminent leaders for this kind of idea were the American politician William McKinley, who was first famous as a congressman and then later as president, and the Russian statesman Sergei Witte. There is Mark Hanna was McKinley's closest ally politically and in terms of the program. And Dmitry Mendeleev, the scientist, was the closest ally of Witte throughout the development program of the 1890s. These 2 men worked in tandem, McKinley and Witte. Next slide. So think now about the idea of making a new world. And this is how it was done from the American standpoint. We built fast and safe railroads. This is a picture of what I think is the first Pennsylvania Railroad train with the Westinghouse air brake, and there's a picture of one of those air brakes. So this and other measures of these companies revolutionized the rail transportation. Next slide. Americans also helped build modern railroads in Russia and China. Sergei Witta's transcontinental rail line, called the Trans-Siberian, from Moscow to the Pacific coast, went through Russia in a cold region, but it primarily was aimed to go through China through an extension called the Chinese Eastern Railway. That railway was built mostly with American components. And here you see on the lower right, the components built in America that are landed here at Hong Kong to be forwarded into China for the construction of that railroad. Also, Westinghouse built an air brake factory in St. Petersburg to facilitate the Siberian Railroad. Next slide. Americans built steel mills in this period, gigantic steel mills with great machines in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, a new center in Eastern Ohio, and in Illinois. Next slide. Americans also built very important steel mills in Russia, Mariupol, what's now Donetsk, Monterrey, Mexico, 1900, the time of McKinley, the first steel mill in Latin America, very important to Mexico. And in Sakshi, India, and you see the date there, that's after the McKinley era, but it has a very fascinating story that has nothing to do with Teddy Roosevelt. Next slide. Edward Doheny outflanked Rockefeller in the USA and built a new oil industry in California. He also went to Mexico and built the oil industry of Mexico. He went down there in 1900 under the McKinley arrangements. Next slide. Americans also helped Russia build the world's longest pipeline, to outflank, helping Russia to outflank Rockefeller's oil monopoly very deliberately. There were 3 great American firms involved in this. Next slide. So the United States and Russia together aimed at the development of the world, certainly the development of Asia. That did not allow for the continuation of the imperial system to the extent that we were successful at that, both the US and our great friend, Russia. So they, a coup d'etat, a regime change was organized from Britain and from within the United States. Here are the central organizers of the coup d'etat. They formed this circle starting 1886. The British fellow on the right, Cecil Spring Rice, was a British political operative on the ground in the United States, attached to the embassy. First took up friendship with Theodore Roosevelt. All 3 of these Americans, for personal and family background reasons, were oriented to treason against the United States of America. They were all deep Anglophiles, all of them affected to be American nationalists in one way or another. Henry Adams was simply pessimistic about any government. He's a great anarchist. But they're all working together in a little circle. Next slide. Regime change had 2 headquarters, 1 block apart. The first and main place was in the Henry Adams house, which was a smaller part of this palace across the street from the White House. John Hay's mansion was physically attached to it. In Henry Adams' parlor, this clique, this circle, Spring Rice and his friends met and planned regime change starting in the 1880s. The other center was the Metropolitan Club, a men's club. Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge might stroll together from Adams Place to the Metropolitan Club. It's like White's Club in London, which legend has it, the whole British Secret Service did their great decision-making and negotiations at the bar at White's Club. This is similar. Next slide. 1895, the Cubans rebelled against Spanish colonial rule. And they set up, or somebody set up, a Cuban junta in New York City to run the attempt to get the United States to intervene on the side of the rebels. This clique of Spring Rice and the Circle took charge of this American intervention effort. The Cuban junta leader, Horatio Rubens, met repeatedly with Henry Adams and his circle. And it's an interesting part of this is that Horatio Rubens is a New York Jewish lawyer, and Henry Adams was a violent anti-Semite. Next slide. McKinley feared appointing Teddy Roosevelt. When McKinley was elected, Lodge went to McKinley, whom they hadn't supported for president. They feared McKinley, but Lodge asked McKinley, put Teddy Roosevelt into the Navy Department as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He told Lodge, I hope he has no preconceived plans which he would wish to drive through the moment he got in. So this clique were scheming to get a war started. McKinley was above all presidents we have ever had devoted to peace. So Lodge lied to his face that Teddy Roosevelt would support the established policy, and then Lodge organized a ferocious campaign to get Teddy Roosevelt appointed and hemmed in McKinley. Next slide. Once Teddy Roosevelt was appointed and McKinley gave in to the pressure, partly because Lodge is a very important senator representing the Boston Brahmins and the money from New England. Once Teddy Roosevelt got in there, he immediately began attacking President McKinley. One of the famous things he did in public was at the Naval War College. It's a center for Anglophile intrigue, along with the Office of Naval Intelligence. And Teddy Roosevelt organized this British faction within the Navy. In that address, he directly rebutted McKinley's inaugural address. McKinley had invoked George Washington, saying we should not entangle ourselves in wars. We must keep the peace, and we must remain neutral, and we will be the friends of all nations. Teddy Roosevelt threw red meat to the sailors, to these officers, mocking peace preachers for cowardice. Directly insulted the president. This was not on the front pages of the papers, but it was circulated all over the Navy, and McKinley and Secretary of the Navy, Long, Teddy Roosevelt's boss, read this, and they swallowed their pride. They didn't want to get into a fight with him. Next slide. At the same time, fire from below began. A British-based anarchist leader named Peter Kropotkin, who was a Russian prince who had been in jail and escaped from prison in Russia. Now he's in exile in England. He went on tour of the United States in 1897, the first year of McKinley's presidency. And the target of his communication with the American anarchist movement all over the East Coast was that the American and Russian regimes were tyranny. He wrote at the time that nothing but war without mercy will solve the problem in America. But also he's organizing against the Russian and justifying the murder of Alexander II. In the pages of Atlantic Monthly, they turned over their magazine to him to write his memoirs, justifying the murders. Harvard was his main sponsor, and they had pre-Raphaelites there, and these are feudalists, and they were closely connected to the pre-Raphaelites in England, who were the main base of Kropotkin's politics in England was the home of the Rossetti family. Next slide. Also, Emma Goldman was his disciple, and she used that same pre-Raphaelite Rossetti's as her home base. At this time, there was a terrible bubonic plague and famine, 1897 and 98 in India. The food was being exported. Millions died. Teddy Roosevelt wrote privately to his mentor, Cecil Spring Rice, urging the English in India to, quote, suppress promptly any native newspaper that was seditious, arrest instantly any seditious agitator, put down the slightest outbreak ruthlessly, and encourage the warlike races so long as they were absolutely devoted to British rule. If such a letter at that time, in summer of 97, had been made public, Teddy Roosevelt would have been annihilated. Next slide. Spring Rice wrote in one of his letters at that time to Teddy, when there was a fierce battle going on in American politics, whether to have American forces interfere in the Cuban insurrection against Spain. That is, we should take the side of the rebels and make war on Spain, which was governing Cuba at the time. Spring Rice urged Teddy Roosevelt to lead in overturning the president's policy. This is a quote from Spring Rice. "It is rather hard for people of our blood to sit quiet with such things going on in Cuba. The English were hoping for the credit of the race and language that all America would go jingo mad." Much later, Teddy Roosevelt wrote, 1911, that the Declaration of Independence, he called the idea of the equality of man the ravings of feeble-minded sentimentalists. That's the forefathers, according to Teddy Roosevelt, after he was in power in the United States. Next slide. At a certain point in the battle over whether we should have a war, which would completely overturn, a foreign war to build us up as a militarist power in the world. While that's going on, rebel spies in Cuba stole a private letter from the ambassador of Spain to the United States, Enrique de Lome. And the part of that letter was published on the front pages of the New York Journal, which was fed by the junta, all the stuff. The other part of that letter, historians have never discussed. And you can easily look this up on National Archives. It's one of the most famous letters. This is what Spain's ambassador to the US at this time wrote. "I do not think sufficient attention has been paid to the part England is playing. Nearly all the newspaper rabble that swarms in the hotels are Englishmen, and while writing for the journal, they are also correspondents of the most influential journals and reviews of London. England's only object is that the Americans should amuse themselves with us, meaning Spain, and leave her alone. And a war with Spain would stave off the conflict with America, which England dreads. Next slide. A few days after this sensation about what was sensational about that letter is that it had language insulting to President McKinley, and that's what they put on the front pages, not this other part of it. The battleship Maine that had been sent as a friendly gesture by McKinley into the harbor of Havana. The Spanish also sent their battleship Vizcaya into the harbor of New York as a gesture of friendship. The battleship Maine exploded. 260 American sailors died. Teddy Roosevelt suppressed the testimony of the Navy's leading expert on explosives, Captain Philip Alger, who said that it must have been an internal explosion. No mine or torpedo known at that time would have caused what happened. The magazine blew up inside because of coal fire. The morning, this is a quote from the New York Times. I photographed it. The morning after the Maine was destroyed, this is Captain Alger's obituary much later. The morning after the Maine was destroyed, Captain Alger put up a bulletin at the Navy Department stating that the vessel had been blown up from an internal explosion. The act of posting that caused a commotion, and the notice was soon ordered down by Mr. Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Teddy Roosevelt proceeded to factionalize within the Navy Department to stop any testimony, any witnesses from coming to the Board of Inquiry about what happened there that were not favorable to the outcome that he wanted, which is to say that an external mine or torpedo blew up the thing. And so this was a great boost towards a war. Next slide. 10 days after that, that explosion, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, took action while the boss, the Secretary of the Navy, was off for the afternoon. He sent a memo to the commander of the fleet in Asia, whom Teddy Roosevelt himself had intrigued to get into that position as head of the fleet. They would meet at the Metropolitan Club and scheme. And then later on, George Dewey was president of the Metropolitan Club. So this is what Teddy Roosevelt sent, this order. Order the squadron to Hong Kong, keep full of coal. In the event of declaration of war with Spain, see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic coast and then take offensive operations in the Philippine Islands. No war in Asia had been contemplated by anybody in the administration, and people were not talking about it in our country. They were talking about Cuba. That order set in place a global war. Immediately afterwards, Roosevelt and Lodge and this so-called junta of Cuba, the rebels, boiled the Congress and the military to push through this war. McKinley resisted to the very end, and even the so-called message asking for a declaration of war, he never asked for a war declaration. He asked Congress to look at the facts and do the best they could, give him authorization for force. This whole thing was a scam and is reported completely fraudulently by historians. Next slide. The war made Theodore Roosevelt a hero. I'm not going to go into details there. Fast forward to 1900, towards the end of McKinley's term, first term in office. Henry Cabot Lodge was chairman of the Republican Convention, he personally orchestrated Roosevelt's nomination for vice president, not at the convention, but before then, and solidified it at the convention. So he was nominated to be vice president, a candidate of the Republicans, and they were elected together, McKinley and his worst enemy, Theodore Roosevelt, on the ticket, president and vice president. Next slide. At this time, after they were elected and Teddy Roosevelt was one heartbeat away from the presidency, Prince Kropotkin made another tour of the United States, sponsored by Harvard and the Lowell Institute. The guy on the left is Augustus Lowell, then the Boston Brahmin, who was part of the Immigration Restriction League, Lodge's group. And he's brought in to speak at the Lowell Institute and pay him handsomely for his tour. It was Emma Goldman, Kropotkin's worshiping disciple, who planned his tour on themes of American and Russian tyranny. Now, it was on this tour, at this time, this very time, in the time from, I think it was in June, July, right after he had left, Kropotkin had left a long visit to Chicago. Leon Czolgosz met Emma Goldman in Chicago. Anarchists put out a paper, later famous, denouncing this guy as a police spy. He went to Buffalo shortly after that, where Kropotkin had a secret 2-day powwow with a British agent from Canada before he left our country. I don't know what happened up there. But he assassinated President McKinley, who was giving a speech on peace in Buffalo. And this guy, Leon Czolgosz, was executed without saying anything except, "I'm responsible for everything. Nobody put me up to this." His last 3 years, very little is known about him. Who done it? Look at, see who benefits from it and who organized the anarchist movement and who organized the assault against President McKinley from the top. These are the people that took over the country. Next slide, if there is one. That's it. So after this, Teddy Roosevelt, as you know, set up wars. The war was already going when he came in as president on the assassination of McKinley. And he got us into an alliance with Great Britain, which caused tragedy because the whole alliance was based on the theme that he had pursued in this coup d'etat. That is, that the United States should have war on behalf of the Anglo-Saxon rule of the world. And that war, in one way or another, has continued from that time to this. That's the problem that we have in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much for that presentation. So the idea that we had for this panel, How the Nation Was Won, has just been presented to you. Also, How the Nation Will Be Won. Think about this as a sort of real briefing session by
Not really.
American intelligence and operations capability. That's what it is, and that's what we're resurrecting. And I wanted to say about that, panel 3, American and Prometheus. Is that what it says? Yes. Moderator Elliot Greenspan. So we'll be starting at 6:15 sharp. Diane wanted me to motivate people or make sure that people would be motivated to come back. I think if you've been listening, you probably are motivated to come back. Should be. And if you aren't, then you'll miss my presentation about Edgar Allan Poe's sex life. But if you're not interested in that, you know. Whatever floats your boat, as they say, right? All right, otherwise, Diane said, okay, there's a list of restaurants within 3 miles at the hotel front desk. Let me ask you a question, Diane. You have this thing about quick Philly cheesesteaks, Campus Corner. Is that right here? That's around the corner. Yeah, but do they have hoagies? That's the question, Steve. I'll have to ask this. Okay. So anyway, we'll be back here again in exactly 2 hours. Yes. All right, so you want me to say something about how people should stop by the literature table, obviously, and pick up things like Tony's book and other material, and make sure that you get very engaged. There's palm cards there. There's all kinds of other capability. But